Hey, what is up, everybody? Welcome to episode 3 of Bible Basics. I am so honored that you are joining me for this journey throughout the Bible. And my prayer for this whole series is that it breaks down any fear, it breaks down any intimidation that you may have whenever you go to the Bible, you try to start reading and that kind of stuff. And so I'm hoping that this will break a lot of that intimidation down so that you can go to the Bible with fresh eyes and feel confident whenever you open it that God's going to speak to you and that you're going to be able to grow to be more like Jesus. Now remember that the Bible is divided up into two sections. There's the Old Testament and the New Testament. The Old Testament is the history and record of the creation of the world as well as the story of the fall of man. That's whenever sin entered the picture and separated us from God. And then it follows the history and movement of God's people, and it contains the promise that one day a Savior would come that would save us. That Savior's name is Jesus, and that's what the New Testament is all about. It contains Jesus' life, death, and resurrection. That's when he came back to life. The story of the early church, and the promise that one day Jesus would come back again. Now in this video, we're going to start at the very beginning of the Bible. In the Old Testament, the first book is Genesis. The reason why we're starting here is one, because the Old Testament has a few more books than the New Testament does. So the rhythm that we'll probably have throughout this series is 2 books in the Old Testament, 1 book in the New Testament. So you can expect that in future episode releases and things like that. Genesis is the first book in the Old Testament, but it's also the first of the 5 books in the Pentateuch. Now remember, the Pentateuch literally means the first 5 books of the Bible, and these 5 books are unique because they were all written by a man named Moses. And this first book isn't necessarily about the life of Moses. It's more centered around the creation story as well as the life of a man named Abram, whose name would change to Abraham. And so let's dive into it. I'll give you a brief 30,000 foot look at Genesis, and then I'll share some of the things that I think is super significant, things that have really spoken to me about this book. Genesis contains the history and record of the creation of the world. You can read that at the very beginning of Genesis. It also contains the history of the fall of man, whenever sin entered the picture. Now, all sin is disobedience to God. It's doing things our way instead of God's way. And when that happened, it broke off the relationship that God intended for us to have with him and created distance there. It separated us from God and meant that we were going to be slaves to that disobedience and to that sin. But God had a plan, and that is Jesus. And we'll get to that as we continue going. So after the story of the creation of the world and the fall of man, Genesis really centers around the story of this man named Abram. Now, Abram didn't grow up following God or anything like that, but when God called him, Abram decided to put his faith in God. God changed his name from Abram to Abraham. So we follow the life and story of Abraham and his family, and then ultimately towards the end of the book, we pick up with Abraham's son Jacob and his family as they enter Egypt. And so that's a brief 30,000 foot look at Genesis. And my favorite part of it really comes from that beginning piece whenever sin entered the picture. Now, obviously, that's not a good story. That's the story of whenever we were separated from God. But what's so cool about it is that you can see that God had a plan from the very beginning. And so when God is walking through the garden, calling out for Adam and Eve, he knows what they've done. He's God. He's sovereign. He knows that they made a decision to sin against him, but he's still a loving father pursuing them and seeking them out. And when he finds them, he doesn't just cast condemnation. He's not sitting there with a baseball bat waiting for them to come back home after they've disobeyed. He's there pursuing them lovingly, and he lets them know that the consequence for their sin would be death. But instead of snapping his fingers right in the moment and saying, poof, you're dead because you disobeyed, God took the life of an innocent animal that was close by so that would be the atoning sacrifice. This is going to be a theme throughout the Old Testament, a sacrifice that would be sufficient to forgive them of their sins. Now, obviously, they were still separated from God because that sacrifice was only temporary. But what that foreshadows, that one day there would be a sacrifice that would forgive the sins of the world. And that's through Jesus on the cross. This video is about Genesis. I hope that this has encouraged you. This has broken down some of those barriers, maybe in your mind or in your heart as you look at the Bible. I want to encourage you as you open up the Bible and start reading it. If you have any questions, you can use the comment sections of these videos to let me know what questions you may have about the Bible. And I would love to look at those. And I promise you that I'll look at those questions from a biblical standpoint and from a Christian worldview. And so thank you so much. If this video has blessed you at all, I really encourage you to like, subscribe, and share. And I would love for as many people as possible to see these videos and be encouraged to jump in their Bible and know that they can feel confident that God has given them everything they need to read and understand the Bible and to grow to be more like Jesus. And so I'll see you for the next video. Peace. I don't know if I should keep that in there.